All right, you're going to have to forgive me as I race today. Rick has to get to work, and he has to leave here at a certain time. I don't want him to hear at least a third of this anyway. Okay. Welcome to another installment of our overview of the Old Testament. And we have finished up 2,000 years of pre-Israel history by looking briefly at creation, corruption, and how countries began. But that's only 11 chapters of the 929 chapters in the Old Testament. The rest of the Old Testament, 2,000 years of history also, belongs to Israel. And last week we started Israel's 2,000-year history beginning with the patriarchs, the fathers of the nation. And by way of reminder, who are the patriarchs? They are Abraham. God did not begin forming this country with a group of people that spoke the same language or with a family, but with an individual. His name was Abram. Changed his name to Abraham. So if I swap back and forth between Abram and Abraham, it's because God swapped his name. He had a son named Isaac, through whom the promise and the covenants would be perpetuated. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. You going to do that? You going to change his name to Israel? Okay, we won't change Jacob's name to Israel. But Jacob in the Bible, God changed his name to Israel, and it is for Israel, not Abraham, not Isaac, but Israel, or Jacob, that the nation of Israel is named. And he had how many sons? He had 12 sons. And they had big families. These families became the tribes. 12 tribes of Israel. Now you understand who the patriarchs are. And we looked at Abraham's life right up to the moment he was converted. Abraham was not converted in Ur of the Chaldees. He wasn't even converted for the first decade or so that he came over to the land where the Canaanites were dwelling. Now, very briefly, God moved Abram, because that was his name at the time, from Ur of the Chaldees, that's in southeastern Mesopotamia, over near the Persian Gulf, over to the land where the Canaanites were dwelling. And he says in chapter 12, "Go from your country." Well, Abram sort of did that. He said, "and from your kindred." Who are kindred? Well, that's your family. People who are related to you. And, in particular, from your father's house. Because he knew if he dwelt in his father's house, that his father, until his father died, would be in charge. And go to the land that I'm going to show you. Why is God going to show him this land? Because he's going to give it to him and to his children and grandchildren and so on. And then he says, "I will make of you a great nation." Out of one man. That implies that he's going to have children. Keep that in mind. "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." Don't forget that. That's going to be important today. "And I'll bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And by all the families of the earth in you, they shall bless themselves." So Abram moves from Ur of the Chaldees over to the land of Canaan. It's quite a journey. He gets sidetracked because he didn't follow directions. He brings his nephew Lot. What did God say? Leave your kindred behind. He says, and leave your father's house. And what does he do? He brings his daddy. And now daddy's in charge, and daddy says, well, we're going to Haran. And who knows how many years they were in Haran, delaying Abram from getting over to the land of Canaan, just because he didn't follow God's direction. So he moves over there, and remember, the land of Mesopotamia is a rich, lush, vegetaceous area on the face of the earth because of all of the rivers that overflow their banks. And he gets over here in the land of Canaan, and what's he face? he faces a famine right off, and the famine is very severe. So instead of stopping to think, God said he's going to make a great nation out of me. That means if I stay here in the land that he says I want you to go to, he's going to take care of me. But Abram didn't want to wait to see what God's solution was. So he hightails it to Egypt. And he relocates down there to get away from his problem. And to make matters worse, he says to Sarai, because she's not known as Sarah yet, Sarai, tell everybody you're my sister because, babe, you are a babe and everybody is going to want you. And if they want you as my wife, they're going to kill me and they're going to get you anyway. So Abraham, looking out for his own skin, gets Sarah to lie. And of course, they had some trouble down there, and Pharaoh found out about it and sent him back to the land of Canaan. Probably still a famine going on. But God took care of him, didn't he? Sure he did. But when he gets back there, his herds have increased, and Lot, his nephew, who is with him, his herds increase, and they have some trouble. Their herds can't dwell in the same grazing place anymore because it won't accommodate both of them. So Lot moves on down into the Jordan Valley, moves south, actually southeast of the Dead Sea. He's way down there near Sodom and Gomorrah. Now that should make a bell go off in your head. He's living down there near Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's not the end of Abraham's trouble with Lot. Because some of the kings came over from Mesopotamia, 4 of them, and their armies, and they beat up Sodom and Gomorrah. And they took all their possessions, and they took all their people, and they fled back to their own land. Well, Abraham, with 318 trained men in his household, went after 4 kings and their armies and whooped up on them. Now, let me remind you at this point, who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. And Moses has just led a bunch of people out of the land of Egypt. And he wants to take them into the land of Canaan to beat up on people who are bigger. And there's a lot more of them. And he's trying to demonstrate in this story that even if you've got a few, if God is on your side, you will succeed. And Abraham not only beat up on those 4 kings and their armies, he got all of the possessions and the people back, and he heads back down to deliver them to Sodom and Gomorrah. And on the way, he passes through a town called Salem. It's not Salem, Massachusetts. It's Salem in the land of Canaan, and that will eventually become Jerusalem. And the king comes out to greet him, and he blesses Abraham. Did not God say, I will bless you? And he provides wine and something to eat for Abraham and all of the people. And this king also happens to be a priest of the Most High God. So there's at least one person in the land that is a true believer, and his name is Melchizedek. And Abram recognizes, even as an unbeliever, that this man is a priest of the Most High God, and he gives him 1/10 of everything he took in the spoils. Sends Lot and everybody back to Sodom and Gomorrah, and the next thing you know, he's talking with God because he's thinking after this ordeal, I've been in the land for more than 10 years and I still have no children. How are you going to make a great nation out of me? And he says to the Lord, you know, this slave guy that I picked up here in Damascus of Syria, his name's Eliezer. He's going to be the guy who inherits everything that I've got. And God says, no, he's not going to inherit. You, Abraham, are going to have a son. Now, you've got to put this in context. All the people of Yahweh from the beginning of the Old Testament have been looking for a deliverer. And God told Adam and Eve by speaking to the serpent in the garden, the seed of the woman is going to crush your head. So they've all been looking for this seed that's going to be born at some time in the future, who is going to be a hero, a champion. And Abraham knows that person is going to come from my loins. And it is through Abram's seed, Paul tells us in Genesis chapter 3, that particular seed is Jesus Christ, through whom all the families of the earth will bless themselves, because he will not only be a hero and a champion and crush Satan's head, but he will redeem us from our sins. And it is in that context of that information that Abram believed God's word, that he would perpetuate Abram's seed, and God credited it to him as righteousness. And that's where we left off in Genesis chapter 15 with the conversion of Abraham. So, what did we learn? We learned that when we fail to follow God's directions, it tends to delay God's blessings. Remember, Abram did not follow God's directions. He brought his nephew Lot. That caused trouble. He brought his father. That delayed Abram getting into the land. He did not follow God's directions. We tend to fail to follow God's directions when the affection of or affection for someone becomes more important to us than we should. And I've spoken to people, where do you go to church? Well, we go to church we did go to church at such and such a church, and I know the pastor, and he's a theologically sound fellow. So where do you go now? Well, we go to this other place that has shallow teaching. Why did you switch churches? Well, because of our children. We love them, and they're happier there. Whatever happened to what Joshua said? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Because you love your children and you want them to love you. Your daughter comes down the stairs with a dress up to here. You say, well, have a good time tonight, honey, or you're not leaving the house in that outfit. Well, you don't want her to stop loving you. So you fail to follow God's directions for your household. You're not going to that party, son. I know who's going to that party, and I know what's going on there. Folks, we're going to be in a position many times in our lives. We're going to have to make a decision to follow God's directions or to succumb to the affection of someone that we love. And Abram faced this, didn't he? He loved his nephew Lot. He loved his daddy. It didn't make any sense to him that God said, you've got to leave them. But God has a reason for that. You remember? They all worshiped other gods over there in Mesopotamia. And Jesus says this, if anybody comes to me and he does not hate his own father and mother, his wife, his children, brothers and sisters, yup, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And if you're not his disciple, you're not going to be part of his kingdom. Now let me explain what Jesus means by the word hate. We think of hate as, I despise you. I hate your guts. That's not always how it's used in the Bible. For instance, God says, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Doesn't mean he felt bad about Esau. It just means I rejected him. My choice, my preference is for Jacob. And we must always be ready to communicate that our choices, our decisions in life are to follow God's direction, even if it goes against the affections of our mom, our dad, our wife, our children, or whatever. We tend to fail to follow God's direction when the approval of somebody else becomes more important to us than it should. 30-some years ago, when I took the first church up in Vermont, I was teaching about creation and evolution, and demonstrating that scientific evidence, empirical evidence, really does demonstrate that things were created. And what we now see did not and could not just evolve. Well, after church, some of the ladies got together and approached me and said, well, you hurt so-and-so's feelings. I says, how did I do that? Well, he's a science teacher and he teaches evolution. So the next Sunday, I start the sermon with an apology and went on with the rest of the sermon. And after the service, my wife, who was the most gentle, non-commanding, non-directive woman that I have ever known, never told me how or when to do something, walked up to me and said, what was that? And I said, what was what? That apology. And I explained the situation to her. She goes, is what you taught biblical? I said, yeah. Why are you apologizing for it? Does their approval mean that much to you? And so I came back the next Sunday and apologized for my apology. And all hell broke loose, I promise you. Paul says it this way, am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I trying to please men? If I were still pleasing men, I should not be a servant of Christ. And I can promise you this, I have gotten in more trouble with my Roman Catholic family because I said what they teach cannot and will not get you to heaven. How important is somebody's approval to you? Are we teaching the people around us that God's approval of me means more than your approval to me? We tend to fail to follow God's directions when we're afraid of someone or something else. Now, when Abram gets in the land, what's he afraid of? He's afraid of starving to death because of that famine. Well, God can't make a great nation out of me if I die. I got to do something to keep me alive. So he heads for Egypt. And when he gets down there, he's afraid of whom? He's afraid of Pharaoh. He's afraid Pharaoh's going to kill him so that he can have Sarah, his wife. And so they lie about it. When we're afraid of someone or something else, we're going to tend to refrain from following God's directions. And Moses, again, wants the people to understand, because they get out in the wilderness when they left Egypt, and what happens? They get hungry, and they get thirsty, and they start whining. But Moses wants them to know that God can and will provide. Just be patient with him. You know, all of us have been affected in some way, most of us financially, by this COVID shutdown. We got people standing in line for food. We've got people, I haven't gotten any unemployment checks. We've got people that are a lot worse off than I, and we've got churches and who have not had a significant offering. In fact, since this began, and you notice that I didn't do it today, we have not even taken an offering here at Oak Grove Baptist Church. But I have every confidence in God that he will supply every need of ours according to his riches and glory, so that we may be of use and a blessing to him. Jesus said, we better not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. We should rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. You know, it's a matter of who you fear the most. Dr. Kent Hovind tells the story about his son who went to the dentist, and the dentist says, I'm going to have to do a root canal on this tooth. And the boy is 12 years old. And the doctor gets out this needle, the Novocaine. And he comes near the boy with the needle, and the boy starts thrashing around in the chair. You're not coming near me with that needle. And his daddy says, just calm down. The dentist is trying to make it numb so you don't feel any pain when he drills on that tooth. Well, the kid wouldn't hold still. He says, I'm going to take you outside and whoop your behind if you do not hold still. Well, it kept going on, and he's a good daddy, so he took him out behind the dentist's office, and he did what he was supposed to do. He brought the boy back in and sat him in the dentist's chair. And that dentist came near with the needle, and that boy was frightened out of his mind. And he looked at the dentist, and he looked at his daddy, and guess who he was scared more of? His daddy. And we need to be fearing him who can destroy both body and soul in hell, but not what just somebody can do to our bodies. We tend to fail to follow God's directions when we are apprehensive about God's care. Well, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? You need to get out there and get a better job so that we can get a better car and all this sort of thing. And Jesus says the Gentiles, the unbelievers, seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. He hasn't forgotten. It has not escaped his notice. But seek first his kingdom so that you can follow God's directions and do things his way, and his righteousness, and everything else will be yours as well. We just need to trust God. What else did we learn from Abram's life? Our sinful solutions are bad both for us and for others. When Abram made that detour down there to Egypt, and Pharaoh thinks that Abe is his brother-in-law, so what's he doing? He's giving him cows. He's giving him camels. He's given him male and female servants, and Abram is getting blessed. But what's happening to Pharaoh? God is inflicting on Pharaoh a bunch of plagues and diseases. Why? Because he's got Abraham's wife. And what is God doing to Sarah? Sarah is now somebody else's wife. Has that been good for Sarah? No, our sinful solutions are bad, both for us and for others. Not to mention that Abraham is supposed to be a blessing to Pharaoh and to his wife Sarah. Is that happening? No. And folks, there is a difference between faith and saving faith. Did Abram have faith when he left Ur of the Chaldees? Well, sure he did. He's been worshiping other gods over there. And then the Most High God, Yahweh, the Lord, appears to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees. And I'm sure Abram hadn't heard of him, but he had just never heard him. He says, I want you to move to Canaan. And it says in Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith, Abram moved out of Ur of the Chaldees and went over to Canaan. But was that saving faith? No. Why not? What's the difference? I'll tell you why. And any similarity between what I'm about to explain to you and the present charismatic movement or Joel Steen's You Can Have Your Best Life Now is purely coincidental. Abram had faith that God was going to do something for him. He was going to make his life better. I got land I'm going to give you. I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and I'm going to bless you. Hey, who wouldn't jump at that? And Abram believed that God would do that. But Abram was in it for what God could do for him. Okay? Is there any repentance of sin? No. No. And then it occurs to Abram, Genesis chapter 15, that how God plans to redeem and to bless the world is going to be through his seed. And all of a sudden, Abram's attitude is different. And he believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay? So that's where we left off. So let's talk about Abram after his conversion. You see there in the red, that's where we left off. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord accounted it to him as righteousness. And then God said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And you're probably thinking, well, God said it. That settles it, right? Yeah, but in that culture, you made things official. For instance, do you know that it is still law in Alabama that a verbal agreement is legally binding? And that ought to be good enough for us. But most of us say, oh yeah, put that in writing. Well, back in those days, they made an official covenant ceremony. What they did was they took 4 or 5 animals, and they cut them in half, and they laid them in 2 rows, and the 2 people making the covenant would walk through the animals together. Why did they have to cut animals in half? Well, the nature of the covenant is like this. They kind of look at each other with the implication that if you don't keep your part of the bargain or you don't keep your part of the bargain, you see what happened to those animals? Well, that's what's going to happen to you. So they cut a covenant. So God had Abram cut a bunch of animals in half, and God wasn't showing up. And Abram falls asleep. And in his darkness, he sees God going through the animals by himself, as if to say, Abram, you got no part in this. You're not going to make this happen. I am. I'm going to make it happen that you have a lot of children. You don't. It was a great idea, because if you couldn't have children, you sent your husband in to one of your slaves. And when she got pregnant, you took the baby, because everything that belongs to your slave also belongs to you. And so Sarai, her name isn't changed yet, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar the Horrible. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Yeah, I know. Go into my maid. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to his wife. Oh, that's a good idea, honey. Besides that, she's real pretty. And they got a son named Ishmael. Okay? Abraham's about 86 years old. God doesn't say anything, except that he's going to be a wild ass of a man. That's how the RSV puts it. Great. So, in chapter 17, this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Okay, now at this time, Ishmael is 13 years old. Sarah has had problems with Hagar and Ishmael since he was born, before he was born. And now Abram is 99 years old, and God says, we made a covenant. And this is going to be a visible sign that you believe that I'm going to make a great nation of you. You're going to have to get circumcised. And Abram says, you want me to do what? With what? And not just him, but he's got to circumcise his 13-year-old son and all of the males who are in his household. They're not children, they're his slaves. And you know what it says in verse 26? That very day, Abram did what he was told. Abram is starting to learn to follow God's directions, and so he does that. Also in chapter 17, we've got some name changes. Abram is no longer going to be called Abram, but Abraham. Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of a multitude. And Sarai, not going to be called Sarah or Sarai anymore, but Sarah. Sarai, at least according to one commentator, means contentious. Poor Abraham. Anyway, she is now going to be known as Sarah, which means princess. Hopefully, I've got a friend up in Vermont I hadn't seen for a few months, and he says to me, he says, Jim, did you hear that Gussie, that's his wife, got an exorcism? I says, she got a what? Oh, I'm sorry. He means I meant a hysterectomy. He says it changed her personality so much. I just thought it had to have been an exorcism. So Sarah, hopefully she's getting a better personality. He says, and I will bless her, and moreover, I'm going to give you a son by her. What's God's solution to Abraham's childless problem? I will give you a son by Sarah. What was Abraham's solution? Well, I'll just get one by Hagar. Folks, just wait. God will come through. Also in that chapter, Abram bemoans the fact that he's going to have another son and that God's covenant and promises are not going to be perpetuated through Ishmael. This boy he's come to love for 13 years, but is going to come through Isaac. And Abram says to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. And he doesn't say that because Ishmael's about to die, because Ishmael lives for a long time. But he wants Ishmael to be significant in God's sight. And God says, no. No, I have rejected Ishmael. But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I'm going to establish my covenant with him, not Ishmael, and as an everlasting covenant for his and your descendants after him. Now, when we get over to chapter 18, God and two angels visit Abraham. And they're eating a meal, and God says, there's trouble down there in Sodom and Gomorrah. Their behavior is absolutely atrocious. And because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, and Abraham knows that God is going to have to do something about it. But who lives down there? Lot. He's not just living down in the area. He has actually moved into town in Sodom, and it's affected his morals. So God and Abram have this negotiation. And Abram kind of whittles God down from about 50 or so. If you find this many righteous people down there, will you spare the cities? And he gets God down to 10. And God says, fine. If I find 10 righteous people, I'll spare the town. So, what happens? Well, Abram gets up the next morning. The Lord had rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, all in the valley, all in the inhabitants of the cities, and everything that grew on the ground. And Abram went out early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Now Abraham, as I mentioned last week, was living between Mamre and Hebron. And it's 3,000 feet in elevation. And it overlooks the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea, which goes down to 1,400 feet below sea level. So there's about a 4,400-foot difference. And as he's looking down there toward the Dead Sea, guess what he sees? He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and behold, and lo, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So, chapter 20. Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev. He's going into southwest Israel. And he dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and And he sojourned in Gerar, which is the southernmost city in the land of the Philistines. You hear a lot about the Philistines in the Old Testament. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." Second verse, same as the first. He hasn't learned his lesson. Why does he do this? Because he's afraid. He's afraid that the king of Gerar, Abimelech, might take Sarah, his wife, and end his life. He's just looking out for his own skin. God has just finished reminding him, I'm going to give you a son, and it's going to come through Sarah. You don't want anybody else touching her. You don't want this to be somebody else's son. This has got to be your son. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent, and he took Sarah into his harem. So how does the Lord react to this? Of course, the Lord's going to get involved just the same way he got involved when Abram did it the first time. And God came to Abimelech, not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that is yours. Now Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored Sarah, his wife, to him. So God said to Abram back in Genesis chapter 12, and I will bless you. And he is. And then Abram prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. Why? Because God had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And now God is using Abraham, sort of, to be a blessing to Abimelech. And he should have been a blessing in the first place, but he wasn't. He caused trouble in Abimelech's house. And Sarah did conceive and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Ishmael is 14 years old. Keep that in mind. He has loved Ishmael for 14 years. But Sarah did not. She hates Hagar and she hates Ishmael. Now that she has her own son, Sarah said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman will not be heir with my son Isaac." And this thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But folks, God asks us to do hard things. It probably was a very hard thing for Abraham to get up and leave the country he grew up in, leave his father and Lot like he was supposed to. But God calls us to do hard things. He gets him over in a land where there's a famine. God didn't tell him to leave. Sometimes God asks us to do difficult things, and God's about to ask Abraham to do something else difficult, more difficult than circumcision. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be displeased because of the lad and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, because it is through Isaac that your descendants will be named. It is through Isaac that I will perpetuate these promises and continue this covenant." So what does Abraham have to do? He has to send Ishmael and his mother out. Go away. You're gone. And Abraham now is at the point in his life where he is starting to listen to God. And then we get to chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to Abraham, and Abraham responds with what? "Here I am." Does that mean I'm over here? No. Let me tell you what that means. That means I'm listening. And now, at this phase of his life, Abraham has grown in faith to trust God, and he is listening. He said, take your son, your only son. Does God recognize Ishmael? Do you know that Abraham had 6 more sons besides Isaac through another woman? How many sons does God think he has? 1 son, who is probably between 17 and 30 years old now. The one whom you love, the one, this is a parenthetical insert, the one whom I said, I'm going to make a great nation of you through the covenants and the promises, and one day the seed that will bless the entire world is going to be coming through Isaac. And go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham gets up about a month later and finally gets around to it. No, he got up early the next morning. He's probably not anxious to obey God, but he does it. And he and the 2 servants go, and they get to the place where they can actually see the hill where he's supposed to be. And he says to the 2 servants, I and the lad are going to go yonder and worship and come again to you. Now, there's a couple of significant things about that. Let's say that Reb gets told by God, I want you to take Jesse, your son, and offer him as a burnt offering. And you'd be pretty sad about that, wouldn't you? That's a hard thing to do. But how does Abraham describe it in this verse? He said, the lad and I are going to go and worship. And folks, never lose sight of this. Anytime we follow God's directions, no matter how painful it is, no matter how detrimental it seems to us, it is worship. But Abraham, it also indicates that he and the lad are going to come back, not just him. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and took in his hand the fire and the knife. And they went on together, and here comes the question that Abraham has been waiting for. My father, here I am, my son. What's that mean? I'm listening. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So he's got him tied up and placed on the wood, and he takes his hand and he grabs the knife to slay his son. The angel of the Lord calls out, interferes with that, and says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says once again, I am listening. He said, do not lay your hand on the lad or anything, do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. In other words, you love me more than you love your son. Your whole world, your whole future, the covenant, the promise, depends upon the life of this boy. And you have trusted me with the details that you haven't figured out. And you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And keep this in mind. Someday, God is going to sacrifice someone, something else, in place of us, instead of us. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. And Moses inserts this, as it is said to this day. This is 400 years later. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Where is the mount of the Lord? Does anybody know where Moriah is? Moriah is where Solomon built that temple. On that same hill, just a few feet around the corner, is a place called the place of the skull, Calvary. And on that mount, the Lord provided. What can we learn from Abraham? God asks hard things from us. Don't expect anything else. God can be trusted to provide, even when it looks hopeless, even when it makes absolutely no sense. God can be trusted to keep his promises. And our children need to hear and to see that we love God much more than we love them. Isaac learned this in a very real way. You think about that. Isaac, between 17 and 30 years old, had known nothing but compassion and love and had never doubted his father's love for him. But what he learned on that day was that his father Abraham loved God more than he loved him. And did he say to his father when he untied him, You go ahead, Dad, I'll catch up in a few minutes? I think I would have. No. I think it made an incredible impact in Isaac's life to see that his dad loved God more than he loved him. And folks, we need to communicate that to our children. And we need to teach our children to grow up and not just to get blessed, but to be a blessing to those around us. So let's